Tim Payne, and I have to fess up that while I have no problem speaking in front of large groups of people, I'm a little shy of microphones, so I'm just gonna roll with it. I'm Tim Payne. I'm the Executive Director at Railroad Street Youth Project, and we're happy to be co-sponsoring this event tonight. Weed is Here, Now What? With the South Berkshire Community Health Coalition, and also with the Berkshire Edge. So thank you to all of the people who are making this possible tonight. We're going to start tonight with a moment of silence. Many people may be aware that there was a devastating fire today. And it comes in a 2-week period where our community has had 2 recent losses as well. So we're just going to take a moment of silence to hold all of the families affected and all of the community members connected from Berkshire South to the Southern Berkshire Regional School District to our Railroad Street staff with a little light and love. Thank you. So tonight's event is a panel discussion, as you can see, and it's designed with the goal of exploring the new laws related to legalization of recreational cannabis use and sales, policy and decision-making at the local level, and the new conversations and issues that are emerging in our families and communities as a result. Our panelists include Great Barrington Select Person Ed Abrams, Railroad Street Youth Project Deputy Director Chris Tucci, Program Director for the Center for Motivation and Change, Dr. David Lane, Great Barrington Police Chief, Chief Walsh, and Sheffield Police Department School Resource Officer, Officer Zuko. DA Andrea Harrington was hoping to be with us this evening, and today's events have taken her away for the evening. The format for the evening will be a panel. The panelists will do introductions, and then we'll follow that with a panel discussion. We'll save the last 30 minutes for audience questions, and I hope you all had a chance to grab a card for written questions. When we get to that portion of the evening, I'll identify our volunteers who will help collect the questions, and when you have a question, wave it in the air. If you need a pen, Sheila Clary has some and we'll be passing them around, as does Kara. The last part of the evening, we really do want to know what you think. So we have some surveys that are out front or passed around. They've been passed around. So please do tell us what worked for you, what didn't work, what else you'd like to see happen in a community forum. Lastly, but certainly not least, tonight's event would not be possible without all of the people who organized it. So I'd like to thank the members of the South Berkshire Community Coalition Parent Education Subcommittee, including Coalition Community Co-Chair Eric Brune from Railroad Street Youth Project, Vice Chair Kara Becker from the Great Barrington Police Department, Dr. Jeff Foote from the Center for Motivation and Change, Stephanie Wright from Multicultural Bridge, Glenn Devotee from Mount Everett Regional High School, Joshua Briggs, local parent and educator, Iona Smith from the South Berkshire Community Health Coalition, and Sheila Clary from the Berkshire Edge. I'd also like to thank and recognize all of the coalition members and organizations, including our youth co-chairs, May Whaley and Megan Smith, from Monument and Mount Everett respectively, Multicultural Bridge, Construct, the Green Center, Southern Berkshire Regional School District and staff and student representatives, Berkshire Hills Regional School District and their staff and student representatives, Sheffield and Great Barrington Police Departments, Berkshire South Regional Community Center, the Berkshire Edge, the Rural Health Network, the Berkshire United Way, and our partnering towns of Great Barrington, Egremont, Sheffield, and Stockbridge. So you can see there's a lot of people behind tonight's event. For a long time, the conversation around cannabis, or pod as most of us probably call it, was a debate. One side argued to legalize first medical marijuana and then later recreational cannabis use. The other side argued against legalization and to maintain the status quo. While this debate was necessary, at times it made it difficult to have other conversations around pot. As you all know, cannabis is now legal for medical and recreational use in Massachusetts, and recreational sales are open. Now that the yes-no debate on legalization has been settled, we have an opportunity to advance a much broader and possibly more nuanced dialogue in our communities. The task at hand at this moment is to pose new questions and seek out the information we need to craft new answers to those questions. Tonight's panel is our way to start this process with you all, and it's a start, not an end. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce yourself.
Ed Abrams, Great Barrington Select Board. A few years ago, I spent a few years working really hard to try, with mixed success, to keep a daughter from smoking marijuana, going to all the parent meetings and getting as involved as I could and trying to figure out what was going on. So when legalization happened, I elbowed my way to the front of the select board and became the person to help implement it here so that we could continue to keep an eye on some of the issues I was concerned about.
I'm Dave Lane. I'm a psychologist and program director of CMC Berkshires, which is a residential rehab for substance. We do evidence-based treatment for substance use disorders in New Marlborough. And I've been working with substance use disorders for the last 14 years as an outpatient therapist and now residential for the last 5 years. I also have 2 8-year-olds in the New Marlborough school system, so I'm not quite at the at-risk age yet, but I will be. So I'm personally, invested in the issue.
I'm Chris Tucci. I'm the Deputy Director at Railroad Street Youth Project, and I work with young folks on a daily basis who are asking questions about pot and cannabis, and who are in different stages of use of cannabis and stopping to use or starting to use. So these conversations are real and are happening daily with young folks and the work that we do. And I also have an 11-year-old who had lots of questions about the lines at the pot shop in town. So I've been having those conversations around the kitchen table as well.
Hi, my name is Trisha Zucco. I'm a Sheffield police officer. I'm the resource officer for Southern Berkshire Regional School District, and I'm a mom of a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old who attend our school as well. As a resource officer, I work with about 700 children aged newborn baby to 18. So obviously this is a group that a lot of this is very new territory for them, like my 9-year-old, and then the 18-year-olds that become part of the legalization of this. It's become a huge issue in youth, just as other things are. So I've been working with our youth in the school. I'm very glad to be here.
I'm Wayne Walsh. I'm the Chief of Police for the town of Great Barrington. Obviously I live in town. I have 3 teenage children, and hopefully I can add something to the discussion tonight. So thanks for having me.
Great, thank you so much. So we had a couple of basic questions for DA Harrington that was just to set the stage of what is the law, and our group of panelists have been very kind in saying that they are willing to fill in. So I'm gonna put the question out there and let you all just jump in. So to start with, a lot of people know something about the laws in Massachusetts when it comes to legalizing recreational use and sale. So they might know that an individual is allowed to grow 6 plants, or if there's 2 adults in the household, up to 12. or that a person can use cannabis in their own home. But there's a lot of other scenarios out there. So what can you tell us about what are the new laws? And from your perspectives, what are common things you might hear that people get wrong about those laws? What do people need to know?
Well, the first is public consumption is still not allowed. You can purchase, if you're over 21 or over, you can purchase cannabis at legal retail shops. You can consume it in your home. I believe with the consent of a lodging, you can consume it there. I think apartments are the same way. You need consent of a landlord. And anybody correct me if I'm wrong on those two. But otherwise it cannot be consumed in public, whether it's smoking, eating, or vaping.
And Officer Zuko, you look like you have more you can add, perhaps?
Oh, I was listening. Thank you. I'd also like to add that as there are open container laws with alcohol, the same goes for open smoking of marijuana. The legalization does not include, openly smoking in public places. It's prohibited in places where smoking cigarettes are prohibited. I just wanted to add that as well. The growing of the plants, correct, 6, 12 if there's 2 adults over 21, not to exceed that. So if you have 5 adults living together, you can't have 30 plants. It stops at the 2-person limit. There's pages and pages of different sections of all of this. I have a 100-page legal update, but we can answer as many as we can.
Okay.
Driving while impaired is also not allowed. Defining what that means is up in the air and difficult.
So a question that comes up amongst my friends often, and maybe this is a question that you can answer, is, so we know that it's illegal out in public, but if somebody's walking down the street consuming cannabis, what does that mean for law enforcement?
I'm sorry.
So the question is, we're jumping into a real discussion here. This is great. So the question is, if somebody is consuming cannabis in public, what does that mean for law enforcement? What are the actions that you might take?
That's just like the open container law. You can't smoke, walking down the street. Same with driving impaired. We have to do an investigation. We can't just anymore say, I think I smell pot. You've been smoking. It's, you're still impaired, just as if you're doing another drug or alcohol. That's one of the things we're trying to tell youth with all the new laws. When someone turns 21, we don't march them into a liquor store and say, here you go. You don't have to push it on them just because it's legal. But there are so many more branches now because we've added this. Another, more hazards on the road. Driving under the influence is just as if you're driving under the influence of alcohol. So it's, the same safety is taken into consideration.
One thing I would just add is that the law is actually a little bit on the complicated side. It's a little bit convoluted if you actually sit down and read it and try to dissect it and interpret it. Both for the public, but certainly for us in law enforcement, I guess like anything, they did not make it totally clear or concise or easy, and a lot of laws are like that. There's a lot of time frames and windows that we have to deal with. The public does as well, but in terms of law enforcement, there's age limits. You have to be 21 or above. There's other things which occur between that window of 18 to 21. At 18, people are considered an adult in Massachusetts as far as criminal matters go. So there's that window between 18, whether you're an adult, but also 21, because you're not supposed to be using this until you're 21. And then, of course, there's all the juvenile issues we get into for people who are under the age of 18, which are considered minor or juvenile in Massachusetts. So there's 3 layers that we have to deal with, and there's also certain levels, that we get into. We get into there's certain parts of the law that talk about up to 1 ounce. There's other stipulations about what can occur from 1 to 2 ounces, and then there's stipulations of law about issues with more than 2 ounces. So, at least from a perspective from the law enforcement side, there's all these complicated layers of the onion, so to speak, that we peel back and do try to deal with. So it's not all, one size fits the whole thing for us anyways, and then not for the public either. The public is responsible for, those windows and those age limits and knowing what they are, that they of course follow them and obey them and follow them. So, like a lot of the laws, it's a little bit complex and convoluted. And then you get into the whole area about things like, public and primary residences and, the whole field about motor vehicle and things for us. So, it actually took some training on our part to get up to speed with the law. And, there are a lot of moving pieces to it.
Yeah, so let's unpack a few of those moving pieces if we can. Chief Walsh, I think you might be the most equipped to tell us about this. For people who are under 21, you mentioned that we really have 2 different legal statuses. We have somebody between the ages of 18 and 21 who's an adult, and we have somebody under 18 who is legally classified as a juvenile. What are the consequences for each of those age group of breaking the law and using cannabis or having possession of cannabis? And those are 2 things, I understand.
I just gotta give you a real basic primer, okay? I mean, don't bet the bank on everything to tell you tonight, because
we're figuring it out.
Basically, again, you have to be 21, and those amounts we look at, like up to an ounce, and the law talks about things like outside your primary residence, you can't have up to an ounce. That's perfectly legalized. When you get into the when the 2 ounces range outside the primary residence, it talks about there's a civil penalty, which is basically a citation for $100. It's not criminal, but it's a civil, like a motor vehicle ticket. You write for like a stop sign thing, you get issued a ticket for $100. And then of course anything that's over 2 ounces, you're found with a whole lot in your possession, and the regular criminal laws apply just like they did in the old days. Certainly, dealing and trafficking, you can never ever do that. That has not changed. You can never ever deal or traffic in drugs. Less than 18 years old, you're considered minor or juvenile in Massachusetts, and the juvenile laws apply. And usually that's with civil citations and involving, of course, the parents and guardians. So that's what I meant by all these different layers that we kind of have to sort through and play with, depending on what's presented to us when we come upon a situation.
Thank you. So we're going to start moving our way down the panel and move out of law enforcement for a little bit. For Chris Tucci, if you could tell us a little about, I know in your role at Railroad Street and working with the Community Health Coalition, you're working on a variety of different issues related to cannabis and other drug use among youth. What can you tell us about what the community response is right now? Who's working on the issue of youth cannabis use, and what are they doing? Who's involved?
Well, I can say that for long before cannabis was legal, that there's been a lot of really great and powerful work done in prevention and directly in our schools. We're fortunate enough at Railroad Street where we work with a number of the health and physical fitness teachers in both Southern Berkshire and Berkshire Hills. So I know that the work that the DA supports through the life skills curriculum, which is an evidence-based program around prevention that is taught in our schools. I know that my 11-year-old came home with an assignment from his teacher to write a letter to your parent about your choices around alcohol, and then I was to write a letter back to him what I would like for him around the issues of alcohol. So that's happening in our schools and has been happening already. A lot of really concerned adults who are in the schools caring directly on these issues, but also the Southern Berkshire Community Health Coalition produced and created a series of 8 videos in conjunction with Multicultural Bridge to help parents have conversations around cannabis use. So those are free and available through YouTube. You can go to our website and find access to those. So there are a number of people who work together to provide information so parents could have the ability to have that conversations, and it's based on the research done at the Center for Motivation and Change. I know that Caroline Wheeler and Tanya Beecher are doing programs the 3rd Thursday of every month at Berkshire South for parents and concerned caregivers who want to have conversations around substance use. It's a recovery model group. There's also a parent group that is run through CMC and Railroad Street that they meet bi-weekly. So there are parents that are meeting together who are directly concerned with the use in their household, and they're getting support from other parents. There's also an adventure recovery group which meets every Thursday at Railroad Street Youth Project. So from 3:15 to 5:15, in conjunction with some recovery coaches through Adventure Recovery, we have young folks who are, instead of getting suspended in school or receiving detentions, the really wonderful partnerships that we have with Berkshire Hills and Southern Berkshire School District, they're seeing these needs that young folks have and saying, this is an option for you if you'd like to be in a position to talk about substance use with professionals and your peers to get a hold on that. That's happening. And then across the county, our partners through the Berkshire Youth Development Project, which is Railroad Street Youth Project, the Berkshire United Way, and the Northern Berkshire Community Coalition, we administer the Prevention Needs Assessment Survey, where young people tell us directly about their use, what's coming up for them, and what they want adults to know. So we have real hard data on the usage rates of alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. So we're able to see what's happening specifically school by school, so administrators can make decisions. I know I had a wonderful conversation with Principal Wine at Berkshire Hills today, who is going to be using that data and talking directly with the faculty to say, these are our students, this is the help they need, this is what they're telling us. So that's some of the work that's being done around it.
Thanks, Chris. And for Dr. Lane, from your perspective as somebody who's working with people who are seeking to move into and maintain recovery, what are the implications of legalization for recreational use? Positive things, any reasons for concern?
The honest answer is I don't know, because before legalization, for instance, the rates of, if you look at how many youth had at least tried marijuana by the time they got out of high school, it was 45%. So that's a lot of people trying marijuana. It's inconclusive. There are different. I think it's too new. There are different studies. Some studies suggest legalization increases rates of use among youth, or at least rates of dependence, heavy use among youth. Other studies say it takes the allure out of it now that it's not illegal anymore, and that it actually decreases use. So I think it's too soon to tell. If it increases use, that's where it would be a concern, because there are downsides to additional downsides to youth using marijuana that don't apply to adults, just in terms of developing brains and the impact of marijuana on developing brains. But I think the only, at face value, the advantages I can think of is it does at least take, well, it's still illegal for youth, so it doesn't even affect that much, but to the extent that it makes it a kind of behavioral health issue more than a criminal issue, I think that's helpful, because I think that's just a good way to address it. It makes it safer in that it's more regulated, and the risk of using street drugs and what you're going to get in street drugs goes down. Although again, since it's not legal, there's probably still going to be dealers, and so I don't know that it actually affects that much. It's still going to be non-problematic in moderate use for older people, and it can be just as problematic whether legal or not.
Thank you. And for you, Ed, one of the reasons we really wanted to have somebody from local government is to help make the connection between what's happening at the local level and how citizens can connect with it. So my question for you is that a lot of policy development and regulation for legalized recreational use and sales has happened at the state level. but what are the roles and responsibilities of local government in regulating legalization? What bodies are involved? What different powers do they have? And where do voters fit into that? I have so many questions for you. Just talk about the process. I could keep going. I want to know about town meeting.
I'll get to that.
Okay.
I've recently been asked to testify in Vermont at the state senate and in New York at the New York Conference of Mayors. Both states are considering retail. And the message I brought them is Boston did a really good job. They did a pretty good job with the law in general, but a really good job about local control. They left an awful lot of control in our hands. So they set up a lot of things that we can lean on, what the shops look like, how they're allowed to advertise, the fact that no one under 21 can even go in. I made a point in one of the interviews about this event that a child can walk into a package store alone, with all of that product there, and buy a candy bar. That can't happen with cannabis. So they've done a really good job of giving us the tools to regulate it, but then they gave us a lot of local control. We can limit, where, when, how many, which zones it's allowed, whether we want to allow growing or manufacturing or retail. We can eliminate categories of that. With some restrictions, we can't eliminate retail entirely unless we take it to another vote. Here in Great Barrington, I believe we were 64% in favor of legalizing, which means it takes another vote if we were to ban it entirely. So the town itself was given a lot of leeway. The process the town uses, which is the process the town uses for everything, is for zoning, the planning board starts to look into what they want to do. And they started before legalization came into effect. And they started doing it with, before Boston had even come up with the regulations, they started coming up with potential zoning, really based largely on the medical regulations. And then as the final regulations came out, they adapted it. They have a public hearing, anyone can show up, very few people do. Then they revise, they send the final draft of that to the select board for comment, and then ultimately to town meeting. In New England, we live in the world of hyper-democracy, so town boards are not legislators, they're executive. The town meeting is the legislature, and that's anyone who's registered to vote in the town. So at town meeting, 2/3 of the voters then approved the zoning bylaws. Changes can be made, again, through the planning board, through the select board, but ultimately at town meeting. So the select board is given the authority to issue what we call a host community agreement. That's the first step when somebody wants to open any kind of a marijuana establishment. They come to the select board, they say we want to do it. What we can do is look at the rules, make sure they're following them all. In our agreement, we make sure that they agree to follow all of the state's rules. We look at the zoning to make sure they're where they want to be, they're allowed to be. What we're not allowed to do is say, we don't like you. We can't be arbitrary like that. We can't say, we don't think you should be here if zoning says you can be here. So there's been a lot of talk about a marijuana store between two toy stores. That's not in ours. We don't have the ability to overrule the town meeting, which didn't restrict where. And we can talk about whether or not that's a good idea. So ultimately the voters have the final say in all of this. Did that cover it?
Yes.
So the commercial I want to throw in is whether it's cannabis or anything else that happens in town meeting's the last stop. So go to committee meetings, get involved, call the town manager's office or any select board member and say, here's an issue I'm concerned about, where do I jump in? It's never too soon.
At the risk of throwing a wrench into town meeting, can you explain what a citizen petition is and whether it applies to anything related to cannabis regulation?
Yeah, so how do you get something up on the ballot to vote at town meeting, called the warrant? There are several ways. If it's zoning, it goes through the planning board. The select board can put things on the warrant. And this is the beautiful part of New England. Any citizen with 10 signatures can put something on the warrant of a regular town meeting. So if there's something you want on there, check with probably someone on the select board. You want to make sure it's legal, because ultimately the Attorney General has to approve anything. But 10 signatures can get it on the warrant for a town meeting. There are deadlines for that, and one for citizens and a different deadline for select board members. Another process, which just happened with the attempted repeal of the plastic water bottle ban, you can call for a special town meeting anytime at all. That takes 100 signatures. So it's a little more work, but the process of changing the rules is always open to the public.
Thank you. So the way this is going to work is I'm sure there are lots of follow-up questions that could happen for any of our panelists, and you have the power of the follow-up question with your cards. So I'm going to keep us moving so that we can cover a lot of different ground and hopefully surface as many questions as is useful to you, the audience. So with that in mind, Chief Walsh, you are up. And I wanted to ask you, as somebody who is charged with protection and service, what are some of the things that concern you with the advent of legalized recreational cannabis use that you want citizens to know about?
Well, I think I'd say three things quickly. One is that legalization, as I said a few moments ago, it's, there's a lot of moving parts to it, and a lot of different issues. So the first thing I think is that, we should realize, especially with younger people, that the passage of this law does not just mean anything goes. It's still illegal for the most part, and it's just not like knock down the walls and people can do anything they want. So I think that's important to, again, especially for younger people. We just didn't throw out the playbook and say anything goes from here on out, because it doesn't. People any age, they're going to know what the law says. If they want, stay out of the jam and stay out of trouble. The second thing I would say, from a police point of view, a police perspective, is that, and we've read about that a lot of this lately, I think. It's the whole idea for us is impairment, and what that means, what constitutes impairment, what's the definition of that. Mainly in driving, but it could be impairment in general. This stuff will impair people at certain points, and it'll do the usual things, cloud judgment, and make folks make some bad, not so great decisions. And like anything else, people are responsible for those decisions. So the impairment is another issue. But in our world, this impairment with driving is the real hot button issue now. It doesn't necessarily have to be only driving, but certainly that's the main thing we've been hearing about in the press lately, and it's something that is tops on our radar screen as far as impairment in driving. There's still some issues associated with that. Everybody's still grasping, I think, with issues like what constitutes that, how do you prove it, for legal purposes or for prosecution purposes. What constitutes, we don't have any magical tools or machines like we do for maybe alcohol issues, like breath test machines. We don't have those yet for the drunken driving routine. So it's a bit more difficult for us, at least as far as, doing the roadside stops, building cases, such as cases that are strong enough to prosecute. And there's no magical tools out there. I think there's a lot of things on the drawing board, and someday, some smart person will develop something and, patent it and make $1 trillion off it. Good for them. That will be a tool. You read some other states or other countries are talking about, things like blood tests and saliva tests and things like that. At least in Massachusetts, we haven't come to that level where we can really use those things. And Massachusetts being, how do I say this? A little bit on the, non-conservative side. it probably is going to be a tough sell for us to ever see laws passed where, police will be able to do, saliva tests and blood tests and that sort of thing. Maybe they'll surprise us, but we probably won't see that. But as you take these options off the table that other states are going to probably use, it doesn't leave us too much out there in the whole realm of things. So because it's brand new, it's a work in progress, and we're going to have to see what what the legislature allows us to use in terms of evidence gathering and how do we prove impairment. Right now, basically, we are left with the old standard tools that we use for, alcohol enforcement in OUI cases, things like field sobriety tests and, things like that, observing people and their speech and their gaze and their bloody eyes and that sort of thing. So we're stuck using those things, and it all comes down to a police officer. I'm talking mainly about roadside stops. The officer has to articulate why we think a person is or was impaired. It all comes down to report writing and articulating why you thought that in order to build the case. So we use the tools that we have for OUI enforcement until they come up with something else. Maybe someday they'll say, you can do blood tests or saliva tests, or maybe there'll be some magical box we can hook people up to or have them blow into or whatever. Right now we don't have that, but I think someday somebody will develop something. So in terms of the question, the impairment is a big issue that obviously we're struggling with because it is different from drugs than alcohol. And the state has not really rolled out a lot of, how do you handle all that? So it's really up to departments and municipalities to kind of figure on their own what their policies are going to be and what you instruct your officers. So basically we're using the OUI standards right now. And third thing, I guess, to answer the question is just the health issues. And I'm not a doctor, I don't pretend to be, but I read the same things that we all read. And there are health issues. As a layman, I'm just guessing smoking is smoking, and the lungs don't like smoking, whether it's tobacco or anything else you're smoking. I imagine the lungs don't like it. It's probably not good for them, just from what I read, So it's a general health issue, and the whole concerns about how the brain develops and those type of things, way above beyond my level of expertise, but I think we've all read some of that. There's been some references to it already tonight in the panel. There'll probably be some more. So it's also the general health issues. So for us, the three things I would say to answer the question is that there are still some laws. We can throw out the whole playbook. Impairment is a big issue in terms of how it makes people act and behave, especially in driving, but not only in driving. And then there's the general health issues that I think everybody has, and I have as a parent. But and that's a little bit out of my field right now. So those are my three things I would impart that we should kind of let people know about.
Thanks. And for you, Officer Zuko, as both a police officer and somebody who's really embedded in our local community and has ties to young people through your work as a parent, I'm going to guess that you're probably an aunt, that there's probably a lot of young people that you're connected to. What do you want young people in your life to know about cannabis and the law?
So what I've noticed in school is now, just like alcohol, just like cigarettes, just like anything else that a child can get a hold of, this is one more thing now that's accessible to our kids, because I know just from children reporting, like I said, I work with 700 kids and a mom and a nurse, is that now, well, it's kind of like what Chief Walsh said, it's not a free-for-all. However, well, now my parents have it, which they might not have before, so it's a new thing in the house. So some exposure to another substance now with kids. I've had young kids come and talk about a smell in the house, young kids seeing it. We have trouble also with younger children having accessibility to the new juuling and vaping, which has become an epidemic in our school. So this is one more element that I have encountered. Fortunately, but unfortunately, Jewel has done a very good job of seducing our young children, and smoking cigarettes and marijuana, as I have interviewed students in our school, has become a little bit taboo. The smoking, the yellow fingers, the smell of the hair, the plume of the smoke, the clothes, seems a little uncool to the kids. And marijuana is kind of up there with that. I have very few incidences of marijuana with our children. Vaping and juuling has taken over. So, you know, a lot of the students do know that with a licensed medical marijuana, they do know that there can be some pain management benefits, cancer patients, multiple sclerosis, young children with seizures. It's been medically used. So some of my students see it as something that's not bad, and for those that medically benefit from it, you know, God bless that. But I also want them, like Chief Walsh was saying, that it is something that doesn't impair motor function, sensory input, some decision making, safety while driving, operating equipment, riding a bicycle, playing sports. You know, so the kids, we're really pushing, you know, just safety, not saying, you know, advocating either way. We try to be, you know, we try to be neutral in that, and we try to teach them to make informed, educated decisions for safety with their bodies and safety at home. But now, like I said, it's one more thing on the table for them to be curious about. These kids are like sponges, from very little to older, are very curious, a little rebellious sometimes. Like they're risk takers at this age. So it's one more thing we have on our plate that we're trying to educate them about. And with so many new rules, like I said, I have pages and pages that we still look up things to try to help the kids with education.
Thank you. So Chris, building on that, for some families, legalization of recreational use is changing the kinds of conversations that are coming up between parents and their young people. This might be especially true for parents who have used cannabis in the past or are using it recreationally now. So what are some ways to talk about cannabis and legalization with young people that are honest and can be honest about what that might look like in a family or in our community and still keeps young folks safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think anybody who's ever had a young person in the house knows that talking about something one time isn't enough. If it were, my son's laundry wouldn't be an issue in our house. Because I've definitely told him, when it gets really high up, you should go and do it. And he's experienced negative consequences because of that. He's not had underwear. He hasn't had warm clothes on a warm day. He knows that. We've had the conversation. This shouldn't be a surprise to him, right? But he's a young person, and it's my job as somebody who cares about him to have continual conversations about health, safety, and wellness. And that's the same extrapolation we can have around cannabis, is that I wish I could just sit him down like one day and say, all right, son, you're never gonna touch it until your brain is developed. We've gone and we've consulted experts, and your brain is cooked and done. Cannabis away. That's not going to be the reality either. I know if and when he leaves the house and goes to college, he's probably going to have issues with laundry after he leaves, right? And he's probably going to call me and say, can I bring my laundry home? And I'm going to say, yeah, because I love him, right? And I want the best for him. And that's the same conversations I'm going to have around cannabis, the same conversations I'm having about tobacco and alcohol, is that I understand that I want him to have the information that I have. I know he's got access to all the information in the world on his cell phone, so if I try to lie to him, that's not going to work, because he can just Google check me right there. He has an Alexa, so he can just ask Alexa, and Alexa will call me out if I try to lie to him right there. So he has that information, so it's about us having a conversation. What are the values in my home? So the values I have for my home and my family aren't the same, but I can bet that if you have a young person in your home, you want the best for them. You want them to be healthy. You want them to make decisions that are going to give them the greatest chance for success, and whatever that looks like in your family. And that requires conversations about it so that everything we do communicates to young people. Everything. And this is the part where I'm honest and tell you right now, my laundry is really high. And my wife said to me before I left, make sure you put the things in the dryer. And I didn't do it. So I made some mistakes. So when I go home, I have to own up to those mistakes and say, hey, there was something I was supposed to do, I didn't do it. Are the consequences so great that our family's gonna fall apart? No. But we're gonna have a conversation about it. We're gonna solve that problem. So I think my advice to other parents, the conversations we're having around all of the things that you want for your children, all the things that you want for the young people in your life, these are the same things. It's never going to be one conversation. It's going to be 2, 3, 4, 5, and that everything that you're doing around your laundry, and in this metaphor, your cannabis use, that's communicating to your young person. And so to be honest with yourself, to take a look at like, all right, so how does cannabis play a role in my life? And what does that mean for me? What do I want for my young person around that? And being open and honest about those conversations, because they see it, they smell it, they know it, and they certainly are there to listen. All of the great science tells us that when we have conversations, that's what matters, that relationships matter.
Thank you. So for Dr. Lane, a nice follow-up to that is, we know that because cannabis is illegal at the federal level, it's shaped what access we have to research. But what do we know about the health effects of cannabis use for youth, especially in brain development?
So we'll know more soon, or well, depends on what you call soon. There's a 10,000 participant study of adolescents that's underway now. That's a longitudinal study. For good reason, you can't do a controlled trial where you take, okay, let's give all these adolescents marijuana and not give these, so that would, that's how you get the most kind of solid data, and we can't do that. But a longitudinal study with a big sample size, you can kind of track which people introduce certain substances and when, and they do brain scans, and it's a pretty rigorous study. So when that is all done, and when enough time has elapsed, we'll know a lot more than we know now about the impact of various substances on brain and behavior. So what we have now is just mostly correlational research, looking at different independent studies and comparing, people groups who used marijuana and those that didn't. We know that unlike most bodies, most people mature in terms of how tall they are. Bodies mature in late teens. The brain seems to keep growing and developing until age 25, so just in addition to we know that it's great to delay the onset of experimentation with marijuana as long as possible and to keep it as minimal as possible, at least up until the age of 25. Some of the data that supports that it's risky, there was a study it was in New Zealand, where they looked at youth who started smoking marijuana in their teen years and then continued to smoke it, and this was heavy use. And they found that group of people had on average an 8-point drop in IQ as compared to a comparable group that didn't smoke. And when you look at two groups like that didn't start until adulthood, you don't see a drop in IQ. So it suggests that there's something that happens. Now, what we don't know was that drop because they were too impaired during their learning years and they didn't, we don't know if that's a biological effect or an environmental effect, but it certainly suggests that there's some risks there. There's also, adolescents seem to be more prone to developing marijuana use disorders than adults. You just see a higher rates for, adolescents who try it are more prone to it becoming disordered use. It's hard to say exactly why that is. It's possible that parents get adolescents treated more often than they get themselves treated, so that it might be that it's caught more often. But some of the thinking is that adolescents experience fewer negative consequences subjectively. Their bodies are resilient and they can put up with a lot, and they also tend to experience rewards more intensely. So there's just sort of more positive reinforcement driving them to keep going and less kind of making them stop. Adolescents also just tend to have less developed parts of the brain that control impulses, and and their judgment tends to be not as developed. So all of these things may contribute. So it's just more likely that someone's going to get to a problematic level of use if they start when they're young. I guess the other things that all here too, you don't know what's cause and what's effect, but marijuana is linked to school failure. There's higher rates of school failure and school dropout among marijuana users. It's linked to lower life satisfaction. I'm talking about heavy use here, not just occasional use. So all of these, again, you could say, well, is that because there are the same people that are having problems that cause them to drop out of school also cause them to smoke marijuana? It's possible, but there's enough connections there that it just suggests that there's some significant risks with marijuana use.
Thank you. So
Can I say something before you ask me a question?
I can, yes.
Okay, if I don't cover it, then ask. I learned in your last risk assessment study that teenagers, by and large, are not walking into liquor stores with fake IDs to get alcohol. They're getting it from their parents. In an alarming percentage of them, I don't remember the number, it's with their parents' knowledge and consent. There are part of this legalization has brought us two things. One is we know where people are buying their marijuana, and we have access to the sellers. The other is, in addition to the sales tax, part of which comes to the community, there's a 3% community impact mitigation fee. So we have a big chunk of money we can use in programs that we know work, or we hope work. So for example, I spent many years buying alcohol, bringing it home, not locking it up because I had very young children, I didn't worry. The liquor store would have been a good place to teach me 5th grade isn't too young to worry. I found out when I noticed it missing. My high honors straight A student and her high honors straight A friends were getting into the alcohol. That was a missed opportunity. We don't have to miss that opportunity now. I've talked to the Board of Health already to try and come up with programs and signage and to talk to the sellers just to bring it up. Are there children at home? Lock it up. These are the reasons, while you have decided it's okay for you, it may not be okay for your children. So we can do that educating, and we have the resources to do it. We've put extra resources before we came in. We're spending some of that money on more training for the police in Great Barrington so they know what to do at a traffic stop. So if that didn't answer a question of yours.
Well, it actually works out quite well because with the DA's questions mixed in, it got out of order and that evens things out.
Okay.
So I'll save your last question for the last round. So going back to you, Chief Walsh, one of the things that is a reality is that we've legalized recreational use in Massachusetts and decriminalized cannabis, but it still remains illegal on the federal level. And I imagine that sometimes there are complications around that. How does that come up for you at a local level as local law enforcement? Are there times that the different status in the state and at the federal level is an issue for you?
You're talking about the federal issue?
Yeah, that it's still illegal federally. What does that mean for you on the ground?
Yeah. Actually, it really has no impact on us whatsoever. Again, before they passed this law, it certainly has not since this law. The federal level really has not, I guess that's good news, is that has really not impacted us. It's not like the FBI comes in and does investigations or, arrest people for marijuana things that, that have been here a long time, and that just doesn't happen. There is really no federal impact as far as our day-to-day operations. The only impact on it is because it is, I guess, on ourselves as police officers, because it is a federal law, we're still prohibited. So our policies say, you know, even though it's legalized, it's, you know, okay for everybody else, but it's not for police officers. You're still prohibited from using marijuana because it's a federal statute for us. So it does implicate us really only in terms of our employment, you know, and obviously it's in our policies. We just can't do it. So, you know, and also we're inclined to. So we can't, but that's really the only impact federally on us in terms of day-to-day operation investigations. You know, again, it just doesn't. You know, we handle things in town or sometimes with the state police, but it never gets to the level where, you know, the FBI is coming in and, you know, doing stuff in Little Great Barrington. It doesn't happen. So.
Thanks. So for you, Officer Zuko, like you said, you're interacting with and working with up to 700 young people in a really wide age range. One of the things that was a concern in the state that was part of what led to legalization was seeing in data that certain populations in the state were more likely to end up in prison. And specifically, we have data showing that communities of color had higher rates of really going all the way into the criminal justice system due to having used pot. Since it's still illegal for young people, what do we really need to pay attention to make sure that we don't repeat any of those patterns with young people and are really applying the law evenly? What's happening at the local level around that?
Well, I can speak for the school, and I can speak for my community and the Commonwealth. Going back to also your federal question, I'll answer them at the same time. We're responsible for our community, and like you said, besides our employment, we don't have any trickle down from federal. On top of that, our community and our population, and Great Barrington, Sheffield, where I work, we target the substance, the crime, the situation, the safety of our residents, regardless of background, age. A crime is a crime to us. Safety of children, no matter what economic status they come from, whatever family they come from in school, whether it's marijuana, anything else. We treat the individual, the disorder, the infraction, the sanction across the board. Hopefully that's always the case. We don't pick a target group, you know, I think, say, 5th graders or, you know, Latino population or foster children, and hone in, you know, we're fair across the board with who needs services, who needs help, who needs referral out to someplace else. It's the safety and security of our town, the children, and the school that I work in. It's just on circumstance, not the individual, yeah.
Thanks. So Chris, in the unevenness of the questions, you got left out of a question, so I'm gonna make one up. Because you work with a lot of teens, and you're often in a situation where you might have a teen disclose that they're smoking pot. I think you have a special level of experience around that. What do you think is the most important thing for an adult to know about the first thing that comes out of their mouths after they find out that a young person in their life is using a drug?
I think, and this would be really hard to do in the moment, so I want to acknowledge that this would be really difficult. But if a young person is telling you that, that's really great. That they either trust you enough or have enough of a relationship with you that they're disclosing something that they know could either impact them negatively or impact your feelings or thoughts about them. And so they've come forward with information and they've disclosed that. I think the most important thing to know in that moment is to thank the young person for sharing that. Thank you so much for telling me this. That must have been really hard. That might have been really difficult for you to say that. And then it's time to listen. Because if they've started, right, your instinct, especially as someone who cares for young people, right, is let me fix this problem right now. But you may not have heard what the problem is yet. You may not know why they've asked you or told you this information yet. And this is the opportunity as a person who cares about a young person to listen. And you might hear things that you're really not comfortable with. And you might hear things that really hurt you as somebody who cares deeply about that young person. But they're sharing them. And that is a gift, because that's the door that is opened for further conversation. The opportunity to say, that was really difficult for me to hear, that's totally on the table, right? That is really hard for me to hear that. I really care about you, and to hear this is really difficult. And at the end of it, right, there may not be a solution at the end of that conversation, right? It would be really nice if it was like television and we get that opportunity to be like, and that's why you'll never use drugs again. And like we have like a little rainbow, right? Wouldn't that be wonderful? That's not what happens. What happens is you say, wow, that was a lot for me to take in. And I'm really glad you shared that with me. Is it okay if I think about this for a little bit? Is it okay if I sit with that? Is it okay if I ask you some questions? Is it okay so you hear me asking for permission over and over again, right? Let me know more about this, and to know that this is the opportunity to have another conversation after this, right? If the conversation begins and ends with, I can't, and just acknowledge that anger is going to be a part of it, and you can certainly communicate that to me. Like, I'm really hurt and angry right now, and it's really hard for me to hear this, but I want to hear what you have to say. These are really hard things to do, and you want to know the best way to do it is to practice. Right? Like, our brains are so good when they get practice, right? You just get a chance to do this and practice it. So if you have somebody in your life who you care about and who is willing to practice and play with you, you can say, could you just tell me, like, you just pretend you're a kid that I care about, and you're going to tell me that you're using pot, and I'm going to respond. You get a chance to, like, work these things out. But the opportunity is just to continue to have the conversation. There'll be a why, there'll be a what, there'll be a need, there'll be an ask for help somewhere in that journey. But you don't get to decide when that is. You do get to decide whether you're going to show up for that young person.
Thanks. So Dr. Lane, with the advent of legal recreational use, there's an acknowledgement that not all cannabis use is a public health concern, in much the same way that we look at alcohol. From your perspective, can you speak about when the use of legal recreational substance like alcohol or cannabis becomes harmful or a problem, and what are steps a person or a loved one can take when that happens?
Sure. First of all, I love the way you model talking about just talking to kids, and because it is a really helpful approach and keeping the conversation going. It's interesting because the criteria you would apply to an adult, those criteria that separate disordered use from non-disordered use are pretty clear. It gets fuzzy when you apply those criteria to a 12-year-old, or that, everything gets, when you bring in the effects on the brain and you just bring in and the risks of something becoming more problematic. I think having one of the best things you can do preventatively is just start the conversation early before there's anything going on, and make it safe to talk about, and make it safe to keep talking about, so that if use enters the picture, the more a child feels like, okay, I'm not going to get my head handed to me if I bring something up, and that I can problem solve and think things through. That's going to be helpful in trying to tease apart if something is a problem and how big of a problem it is. I think it's still helpful to think about in adults, including young adults. I won't go, there are 11 diagnostic criteria. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they kind of fall into 3 categories. One is impaired functioning, that something becomes problematic when it's getting in the way of school or work, or roles that are important. When someone is using and driving, or doing dangerous things because of their use. Also, if the use continues despite negative interpersonal consequences, when problems are arising, but continuing to use somehow trumps these problems. So that would be one category to think, is that, you know, is functioning impaired. The second category, I would say, is kind of loss of control of use of the substance. And that could include just having really powerful cravings that are hard to resist. It can include just starting to develop a physiological relationship, you know, having increased tolerance, and that, you know, 2 hits used to be enough and now it takes 10 hits to feel what one used to feel. Dependence, which is a little bit less clear. You know, in alcohol, someone can be dependent and have withdrawal. Someone can be dependent with marijuana, but it takes a while to know whether you're going to have withdrawal or not. But just someone is smoking daily and would have a hard time not smoking, that would be kind of out of control. And the third category would be that the use eclipses important areas of life, that it starts to eat up a lot of time, that it's to the exclusion of other things. And, you know, that the person may have given up valued activities, things like that, because use is more important. So, you know, again, with youth, it's not like, okay, those criteria aren't met, go ahead, young 12-year-old, and keep smoking. It's still great to, for the reasons stated earlier, it's great to try to find hooks to inform, you know, to talk about the risks with kids, to talk about the potential negatives down the road, and see if you can find some ways to motivate, especially the younger the kid, the better it is to encourage them not to smoke. But, you know, I think the more of these criteria you see, the more clear that there is a problem. When there is one, I think there too, it depends, you know, if there's a little problem, just talking to your kid the way Chris just modeled, I think is a great thing, because you don't want to overreact and have, you know, suddenly kind of rob a child of all control in their life, and they are then so resentful at the way you're responding to their use that they're going to rebel even more, you know, when you no longer have control over them. So it's really great to be trying to make it safe for them to be open about the pros and the cons of what they're getting out of smoking. Sometimes it can be helpful to look for competing activities to engage them in that are going to kind of, you know, make for less opportunities to smoke or have other competing rewards. So that would be at the low end of the continuum. Sometimes, though, there's a situation where it's just quite clear that use is problematic, and it may, sometimes you just know, you can smell, although it's, you know, with vaping and everything, it's sometimes harder to detect. So first, just in recognizing a problem, it's in adolescence, sometimes it's just seeing noticeable changes, a sudden drop in grades that's not explained in some other way, a major change in friend group suddenly, someone sleeping all the time, major mood changes, things like that. And then it just depends. You know, it's always great to start. I think sometimes you know, it depends on who you ask for advice, and you can get some pretty old school hard-ass advice that will be, you know, whisk someone off to wilderness camp or something like that. And again, that tends to do more harm than good. It's always great to just start by inviting conversation and expressing, you know, kind of expressing the observations you're having that raise concern, and not in a scary way, and not assembling everyone this kid knows, but just in a heart-to-heart of like, here, I'm worried about you, here's what I'm seeing, you don't see yourself, and, you know, just wonder, is this going on? Sometimes an adolescent will actually be as concerned as you are, and they're relieved to be asked, and they'll talk about it, and then you can kind of problem solve together. Sometimes they'll say, no, nothing going on here, and you know something is, which is a harder scenario. You know, in that scenario, actually in either scenario, if things seem problematic enough, often a good sort of next step can just be getting someone, trying to convince someone to have an assessment with a good therapist with the right set of expertise. That tends to not be as intimidating as can you embark on this whole course of treatment, but can you just start by having a conversation with somebody who might be a safer person to talk to than your parent? Now, then the whole issue becomes finding the right, someone with the right skill set, because there are people that will say, oh, they smoke pot, whisk them off to Utah for 2 months or something like that. And it's really helpful to look for a therapist that is trained in evidence-based approaches, who you can look for buzzwords like motivational interviewing or motivational enhancement therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, someone who can engage youth in conversation in an open, non-judgmental way, and have them feel like they have some control in that conversation. And then the other thing that sometimes you just get someone who is not ready or willing to talk about or acknowledge anything going on. And then sometimes it can be helpful for you as a parent to work with either a therapist who's trained. I'm sure you guys are aware of CRAFT, which is a community reinforcement and family training. It's an evidence-based approach to coaching loved ones in how to gradually kind of encourage healthy behavior, and how to respond to using positive reinforcement to encourage change, to encourage engagement in treatment, to encourage less smoking and engagement in other positive activities. It involves coaching parents on how to communicate. And I could go on and on about that. There too, it's hard to find craft-trained therapists, but there is, on the CMC website, there are resources. I mean, you guys are involved in some parent trainings that you referenced already. There's online craft training that you can access through the CMC website, and you can call us, and we can. Sometimes some of our therapists are available to do some craft work. There are books, that can certainly coach. There's also Jeff Foote and Carrie, the founders of CMC, have an online video series where they walk through. It's kind of like a course, and all that's available for free on the website. So there are ways to get informed in how to kind of take a patient, caring approach to gentle a loved one towards change or towards treatment if they need it.
Thank you. So Ed, you get the last question. We can end on what's our hot topic in the legislative body of Great Barrington, or the select board, which you pointed out is not the legislative body, the town meeting is. So one of the responsibilities that the select board and planning boards have is balancing the questions of concern related to public health and the local economy and growth. Where has this come up so far in the process in Great Barrington, and what has that discussion been like? And specifically, can you comment on the discussion about possibly capping the number of licenses available in Great Barrington to cannabis vendors?
Yeah. It came up in both bodies separately and in the joint meeting early on. Do we want to limit the number? And as you say, we're balancing public health needs and the economy. A request had gone to the planning board shortly before this discussion, asking them to cap the number of banks and real estate offices downtown. At the same time, there are articles in the paper every day about Amazon killing downtowns. Between the Flying Church and the Co-op building at the end of Railroad Street, 12 or 13 new retail spaces coming online when we already had vacancies. So it is in that, it's not just one issue that bodies were looking at. I'm not sure if that's the reason, but there wasn't a lot of interest in either body at that time to cap it. Before I'm finished, I will talk about the current discussions and process, because it may be shifting. There are a few numbers I want to point out. A year ago in July was the first time anyone could apply. That's when the state said go. And Great Barrington, partly due to some pushing, we were ready to take applications sooner than most. We had 4 applicants immediately. In the 8 or 9 months since then, we've had 1. So people are not beating down our doors to open marijuana stores. It's a very expensive process. You've got to have an address before you start, so that means buying or renting a building up to a year before you're selling anything. So that's one number that makes us a little less, feel like it's less urgent and less scary. The other is, right now there are 50, soon to be 51 places you can buy alcohol in the Great Barrington. 41 of them, you can consume it on premises. Some of those are next to toy stores, some of them are near churches. The other 10, or 9, soon to be 10, children can walk into, as I said before, unaccompanied and buy something other than alcohol. And the sky hasn't fallen. So we're not panicked, and we don't see a sense of urgency. I'm saying we. I'm not allowed to speak for we unless you see 3 heads talking at once. So it hasn't been looked at as a sense of urgency. There has been a lot of discussion. It's on a very, in the next few weeks, I think, agenda of the Select Board to start talking about it again. The questions are not should we limit it, because that's something we do, not something we want. The question is, what are we trying to accomplish? What is it we don't like? Do we not like the long lines of stoners out in front of Theory? Well, more pot shops will take care of that. It'll spread it out, we won't see the lines. Do we not want people walking around our streets stoned? Okay, will fewer pot shops matter? Do we just not like the idea of what it looks like? Well, we don't know what they look like yet. So it's not a slam dunk, even if, the question is, do we just not like pot? And there are a fair number of us, 36%, if I have my numbers right, voted not to legalize it. So there are a fair number of us who don't want it here to begin with. I would say, of the 64% who voted to legalize, a fair number of them didn't want teenagers going to jail, and that's why they voted the way they did. It didn't mean they wanted it on street corners. So there is a lot of that. So what we will be looking at the Select Board is, what are we trying to accomplish? And input at the meeting would be lovely, or to any of us individually beforehand. What are we trying to accomplish? And then will limiting the number accomplish it? Ultimately, all the Select Board can do is put it on the warrant at town meeting. And it'll be another debate in what looks like could be a very late meeting. I don't know if that helps.
Well, you can use your card for a follow-up question.
I do want to urge you, if you are Great Barrington residents, to come to, wherever you're a resident, go to your town's town meeting, whether it's this issue or another one. We don't give up our right to legislate locally in New England, and that's an amazing thing.
Thank you. So if Kara and Sheila would stand, and I think Eric, you will also help collect cards. And I don't know, is Stephanie here? All right, great. So we have 4 volunteers who are going to help collect your questions. Just wave them in the air. And if you need a pen, hold your hand in the air, and we'll get a pen to you. I should have begged for really careful handwriting, so I'm gonna just do my best. Ooh.
First week of May, I'll let you know in a moment.
And it is true, all of the towns are going through their own local processes, so if you look on your town's website, information about all Select Board meetings and all meetings, really the agenda is posted 48 hours in advance by law. So you can find out a lot of information that way.
So Great Barrington's town meeting is Monday, May 6th, 6 p.m. at the high school. I should also say the week after that is the town elections for all of our local offices, and it's not too late to take out nominations. My fellow Select Board members who are running for re-election currently unopposed might be annoyed at me. It's not too late to take out papers and run for any of the offices we have. It takes a few signatures and a lawn sign if you're opposed. And if you have questions about how to do either of those things, please let me know.
So I'm going to start us with a question, and Sheila's going to group the other questions. Kara, if you can give those to Sheila. So These questions are related to e-cigarettes. So have e-cigarettes and Juul shown up with cannabis? And do e-cigarettes lead to cannabis use by youth less than 21 or to cannabis use well under 21? So I'm going to open that to anybody. The relationship between Juul and cannabis use, and does starting with nicotine lead to cannabis use in an e-cigarette or Juul or vape?
I'll make a quick comment on that. The e-cigarette, Juul, and vaping devices that our students, that we have confiscated, that we have come in contact with, that we've talked about. I know that cannabis oil has been talked about. We have not had an instance where we've had that come across my desk. I know it's out there and the kids know about it now, but so far in school they're using the bubblegum, mango, pineapple, stuff like that. That's the choice, the flavors of choice right now. What was the second part of that?
Is there a direct causal link that we know of between the use of nicotine in vapes or e-cigarettes or Juuls and cannabis in vape form?
I know that vaping is basically taking the place of cigarettes from my standpoint. I don't think it, at this point, in my experience, has become like a gateway to something bigger. I think they're kind of stuck on the vape right now. They either do or they don't.
Yeah, what we do know about nicotine use and cannabis use is that when they're combined, that the addiction happens, particularly because nicotine is such an addictive substance, and so comorbidity. There's not a lot of data that says a nicotine user is more likely to use cannabis, but when used together, that's a problem. And yeah, they're Juul, there's special canisters made for everything that already exists. So yes, we see it all the time. I just talked to a grandparent last week who found some things and said, I don't know what these are. And I was like, well, I'm really sorry to tell you that these are cannabis strains in the Juul that your young person is using. So yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah, we've seen it too. And there is data that there's a decrease in daily nicotine use among youth, but an increase in daily marijuana use with vaping. So it's sort of, one is replacing the other to some extent, but I don't know if there's a causal link.
Okay. I'm waiting for the rest of the questions to migrate back this way. But I do have one more up here that I can get us started with. So we do have people in Berkshire County that are licensed physicians that are giving medical marijuana patient card recommendations. We have 3 medical dispensaries, 2 that are co-located with adult use recreational dispensaries. And all of the professionals working in these facilities were required to complete training, and all are required to provide patrons with educational materials. Given that level of training and experience, have we, the organizers, missed something by not inviting somebody from one of those organizations to participate in the panel, in your opinion, as panelists?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to hear directly. I mean, we have in our community, they're required to provide $10,000 towards reducing or health information. It's sort of vaguely worded, but I would love to know what those plans are. I know I haven't heard directly. We've reached out and we haven't had a clear answer on what that means. I would love to know what, like, my neighbors, I consider them my neighbors. What are my neighbors' plans around prevention and youth use with the building and with the cannabis that they're selling in my community?
The $10,000 you're talking about is a contribution to a local nonprofit for health and wellness. So it is vague. All of them talk about Railroad Street Youth. The new one hasn't yet, so watch for the money. They all have at least one toe in the local waters. They've spent weekends here, or they've been coming here for years, or they're moving here. They all present themselves as good neighbors and willing to talk. They all seemed really serious about keeping youth, which they legally define as under 21. The data shows that's still too young, or still too over 21 is still too young. So I think had they been invited, you would have had some here, and it probably would have been a good idea.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I would just say, I think it's an interesting, a whole other discussion around, and I'm not an expert on, all the research around medical, like what's appropriate use of medical marijuana. My guess is there are some conditions where where it's very clear that is helpful and effective, and then there are others, in California, I believe some of the problem was everyone got a medical card for anything. It was so easy to get a card, and I think there's just good debates around is it a valid thing to have medical marijuana for anxiety or for certain things, because if you go down that road, it really eliminates other possibilities, but that's for another discussion.
Whoever wrote that question, definitely put that as a request for a future forum. So for Dr. Lane, is there a difference in the effect of cannabis on how it impacts people across genders?
That is interesting. I don't know of any research that sort of breaks it out across gender.
And the follow-up to that is, does the experience of places like Colorado help guide us?
Say that again.
The experience of a place like Colorado or California, does it help guide us in thinking about how to shape our community norms in Massachusetts?
And that's to me specifically?
It was on your card, but I think we can open that one up to everybody.
I mean, I would think it has to, looking to what has happened in other states is it's certainly a good idea in seeing what the benefits and the pitfalls are. But I think there's a lot of conflicting data on just, what goes on, but I think others have more to say than I do.
Yeah. At the state level, they did do a lot of research into other states. I know when it was coming here, I did a lot of reading, and like you say, you read a study put out by an official department in Colorado that says one thing, and then you read another study that says the opposite. Most notably was, is it increasing usage? I've read both. It does and it doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's not always useful.
Yeah. So I'm curious, for law enforcement, are you getting information from other states that you're finding helpful? Are you getting information from other states that have legalized recreational use that's helpful?
No.
Okay, there we go. Anything to add?
I was just going to say that with vaping, drinking, and marijuana, just because of my students, I've researched and seen studies from other places, and different areas have such different populations, such a different demographic. It's so hard to compare Sheffield to like LA, so it's skewered. Yeah, it's not going to be the same. So I can't base my treatment, my mentoring, my counseling with my kids based on, studies from other places. The statistics are very interesting when I've looked up, different effects in different areas and age ranges. Some places start younger, some places, it's so different across the country. It's interesting, but I like to focus on just as far as treatment.
So we may or may not have somebody who's able to answer this question, but I'll put it out there. Are there any regulations that provide facilities for medical marijuana only that are separate from the mixture of recreational and medical use?
Isn't there still one in Pittsfield? Does anyone know? Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I can answer that there are facilities that are providing medical use only. I can't speak to the regulation differences. There are different sets of regulations for each type of facility.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it true that marijuana is considered an entry drug to harder drugs?
That's probably good.
Any panelists?
I can speak to that. It's not, I think there was a time years ago when it was the gateway drug, and for many people it isn't. There are many people who use marijuana recreationally who never go on to use other drugs. There are certainly people who do go on to use other drugs, often marijuana was used along the way, so there may be a subset of people for whom it serves that role. But you know, so I think it's probably there's a higher at-risk population where and it may be people where there's also other underlying conditions, but it's not sort of clearly a gateway drug.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. So question is, why would Great Barrington allow 5 retail stores to open? Isn't that too many?
Can I throw the question back? And how many is the right number? We honestly don't know. First of all, I can't answer why. I can answer why the 2 boards didn't recommend it. It was ultimately the town meeting that voted it. It was just a decision to let the market decide. We just had a discussion over alcohol with 2 new requests for alcohol licenses. Does more alcohol stores mean more drinkers? Probably not. Will more pot shops mean more marijuana? I don't know why it would. It would mean shorter lines, more competition. So that was the thinking. But again, the discussion is still going on. So I don't know if this is the place you want to open it up, or if you want to come to a select board meeting and start the discussion. We're trying to answer that question.
Definitely join the select board.
Or run for it.
Or run for it. There's going to be a seat opening up, right? No.
Well, 2 seats are up for re-election.
Okay, 2 seats are up for re-election. All right, Chris Tucci. I would love to be a fly on the wall of your kitchen. When your son asked you about the long line, what did you tell him?
When he asked me specifically what?
About the long line.
Oh, yeah, so we were coming out of Price Chopper because I really love the fried chicken there. I'm not sponsored by Price Chopper, but we picked up some fried chicken and we're coming out, and he said, "What are all those people waiting in line for?" I was like, "Well, here's the combo. Here we go." I said, "Well, that is Theory Wellness, and they are selling recreational cannabis. Do you know what cannabis is?" "Yes, I know what it is." "Great." That's what they're waiting for. And that was it. That's all he wanted to know. So, you know, like part of me, the part that I had to hold back was like, now it's the lecture that we're going to have about the long line. But it was just because that's all he wanted to know. What was the line for? It was for cannabis.
Why did you say that a lot more donations to Goodwill?
Yes. He said it was donations to Goodwill. It is not.
And for Chief Walsh and Officer Zuko, has the legalization of marijuana made law enforcement easier or simpler in any way?
The legalization of marijuana has not made law enforcement simpler. In my experience, it's made another opportunity. You know, I'm just speaking as a police officer right now. Another opportunity for impairment, another substance to be under the influence of when we go to calls. So it's another element for us to work with. Not necessarily harder, just more. That's all.
Yeah, I'd say it has not made it simpler or easier. Just one thing that comes to mind is the whole training issue. It does require a whole level, definite new level of training for my officers, and I think all law enforcement officers throughout the state are probably struggling with this issue. Just from I hear from other police chiefs and some of the chief organizations, we're all kind of struggling with the training issues. And for my department, we do have a plan to train, 20 officers. We've done that training program, but we're really in the very beginning stages of it. Only a few officers have actually been through it so far. So we're ramping up, we're kind of catching up with it, and I think in general throughout the state, law enforcement are trying to catch up with these issues in terms of training. So we're trying to find different various funding ways of getting it into the budget and getting this training to our officers. There's basically 2 levels of training that we want to give our officers, and obviously it's got some budget locations, which, you know, we're with the board on. And so my answer would be just in the area of training, it's not made it easier. We already had tons and tons of training on everything else that we do. Now this is one more issue that, you know, we have to provide it and make sure everybody has it and they're up to snuff on things. So yeah, it really has not made it simpler or easier.
Okay. You also might be in the best position to answer this question. Has legalization affected the black market? Also known as how everybody got pot beforehand.
Has it affected the black market?
Yeah, that's the question.
If you ask me, I really don't know. I think it's too early. I think it's way too early to tell.
Yeah, my dealer started the Kickstarter, so he's really
So I really don't know at this point. I think it's way too early. Will we ever know? That's kind of a tough issue. How do you analyze that, dissect it, and sort through it, especially in a small town?
Make sure you get their tax return.
All right.
In the long run, maybe they'll have some idea, some data, but it's not the issue where, you know, people are throwing data or information from us, or, you know, it's hard to come across information that's going to help us figure that out, I think. Maybe in the long run, we'll have some idea, but we sort of do not at this point.
Thank you. All right, I think this one's for you, Ed. Unless, Chris, you want to try. Please address traffic and parking concerns in the middle of town with the new stores on Main Street.
Nobody goes to that restaurant anymore, it's too busy. We have, first of all, we have a traffic and parking problem in our downtown. Depending on who you ask. I did an informal study last summer. It's at times as bad as we all think, mostly it's not. More people mean it's tougher to park. Marijuana is a legal product, and selling it is a legal activity, as is selling cosmetics or clothes or meals to people who want to buy it. So why the parking spaces that we have downtown are reserved for non-cannabis customers as opposed to cannabis customers isn't obvious. Should we limit the number of new retail stores that come to the downtown because there's not a lot of parking? The current retailers might think so. On the other hand, the cannabis customers are also buying meals and groceries.
And ice cream.
And actually, it has been reported they're buying candy. So we do have a parking problem. We could, as I said before, the 3% of the tax money that we're getting that is supposed to go towards mitigation, we have to actually use towards mitigation. We're not allowed to just collect it to use to keep our taxes down. The other 3% we can. So that could be a good use for it, is to address the parking issue, which is an incredibly expensive thing to address.
Thank you.
That was my question. I just want to follow up briefly.
I can't let you do it all, and I love you, but no.
You can ask me after.
You have
This is your call to get involved in town politics. All right, so legally, how is it determined if someone is too stoned to operate a vehicle? So you mentioned that we don't have fancy gadgets for it, but for alcohol, we have a legal limit. Is there anything like that for pot?
Since we don't have a measurable instrument, officer training, observation, just the behavior, sometimes we don't know what substance it is. It might be a prescribed medication that someone's having a reaction to. It doesn't necessarily have to be an illegal substance. There's many people who have never taken a prescription medication before and have a disorder or something and take a medication. I've stopped cars before that I thought, you know, something was wrong, and an elderly man was on a new medication. So it's all on our training, observation, and the safety of the person. It's not, you know, we're law enforcement officers, but you know, I care about the safety of the drivers too. I don't necessarily pull anyone over that's swerving with any intent to bang them up criminally, but to make sure that they're just safe to drive, or if they have a passenger, their passenger's safe. So finding them safe, you know, if it's not a legal thing, like I said, just a medication, just to make sure that the driver and passenger are safe traveling. So like I said, to condense that, just right now it's really observation, or if there's evidence of, if I see something flying out the window, I look on the ground and it's a bowl full of marijuana, you know, and it's something like that. But it's just our observation and through the years of training and experience of someone under the influence of something.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think like I said before, I touched on a little bit in terms of the lack of tools right now that are available. So it is training, which is why it's important, imperative that we get our officers some of this training. And it is the experience of the officer, and it does boil down to, like I said before, it's articulating in your report. Each incident is going to be a little bit different and specific, and what the officer saw, observed, smelled, the senses, and what you put in your report that led you to conclude that somebody was impaired with the alcohol or drugs versus maybe it was something else, maybe it was medical or something. So there's a lot of equations that kind of go into this, and so it's not always impaired because of alcohol or drugs. It could be something else going on with people, and that really comes down to training and just officers having experience.
Thank you. So Ed, it turns out you're in the hot seat tonight. Thank you so much again for joining the panel. So this is a multi-part question related to the town. So the first part is that 3% that you were talking about. How is it regulated, and is the balance available to the public? And specifically, who is eligible for use of those tax proceeds? Could elder services draw from these funds?
So let me just quickly explain the tax. The state has a 17% tax on sales, non-medical sales. The localities were allowed to opt into a 3%, up to 3% tax. Our town opted in for the full 3%. We're allowed by the Cannabis Control Commission to charge up to another 3% community impact fee, which the Cannabis Control Commission requires us, and our contract, our host agreement with the sellers requires us to spend to mitigate some of the negative effects. It defines that very broadly. I believe the industry is suing to define that less broadly, to say that 3% is too much. You'll never spend that much on on mitigation. But for right now, we get that 3%. I don't have I could look it up. I might have the agreement on my phone. It says for this, and for other stuff to the best of our ability. So what was the specific question? Can we use it for elder?
Could elder services draw from these funds?
We could certainly use it for health and wellness. I was at the senior center recently that hosted, I don't remember the name of the group in Pittsburgh, where you go to get your medical card. They came to the Great Barrington Senior Center to talk to seniors about medical use of marijuana. We could certainly use that money to have a less, I don't want to say biased, but a more medical view of medical marijuana. We could use it for alternative to marijuana programs. We could, without running afoul easily, we could use that for a lot of things. By running afoul slightly, and again, I don't think we'll be challenged, we can do an awful lot with that money.
Okay. And a town relations question is, are out-of-state customers from, say, Connecticut and New York impacting relations between Great Barrington and Connecticut and New York?
So,
where it's still illegal.
one of the things that Great Barrington required, which was not in the state regulations, was that all of the retailers post signage reminding people who aren't from here, if you're from somewhere where it's not legal, you should know that. If you look at the parking lot in front of Theory Wellness and the illegally parked cars and the Price Chopper parking lot in the front of it, you know, unless the people are buying it and hanging out here for a few days, it's going back to New York and Connecticut. Nothing formal has happened. I know out west, I believe Utah sued Colorado I don't know where that went. But nothing has happened here, and the surrounding states are looking at legalizing.
Okay. You're out of the hot seat now. Yes.
So I think the thing that I would add about the community host agreement, so for those of you who are really loving to read these things, it's in section 3D of chapter 94G in the community agreements, that the 3% gross sales can't be in effect for longer than 5 years.
The agreement, right?
Yeah, the agreement, and that any of the revenue used has to be considered public record. So all the use of that monies will know where it's going as a community, and we can have.
Right, so when I said the Cannabis Control Commission's regulations on how we spend it, the Department of Revenue calls it general, going into general fund. So that money just comes in. Town meeting still has to vote on how to spend that, like every other dollar we spend. If town meeting says, you know what, we want to use that to build a school, and we run the risk of getting sued if you can't prove that the school is mitigating, although I think we probably could prove that, the negative impacts. So yes, the money is still part of the general fund, and the voters still get to decide where every dollar of it goes.
Thanks. So this is our last set of questions, and it's more on the how does marijuana work area. So the first one is, what determines how marijuana affects an individual person? Any of our medical aid folks?
You know, the THC is the kind of most best known cannabinoid that is intoxicating. It turns out there's something like 21 different cannabinoids. That's why with all the medical marijuana and all this kind of mass production, there are all these different strains. So I think there's probably more variation in how you're affected by the product itself than by the brain. I'm sure there's always some individual variability, but like alcohol affects most people more or less. You know, you'll see the same signs of intoxication, and opiates have a certain effect, and different cannabinoids have similar kind of effect.
All right. From that, how is eating and drinking foods that contain marijuana, known as edibles, different from smoking marijuana?
I know it takes longer to metabolize, so the onset is delayed. It can be more powerful, although it depends. It depends on, I guess, maybe that with more powerful strains that you smoke, maybe that's not true anymore. So it's, I suppose you bypass some of the negative health effects of carbonized, that burning something and inhaling, but and I don't know if it lasts longer or not eating. So it's just slower to hit you, but I think can hit someone pretty hard.
Yeah. A thing that can come up with that, I know I'm not a panelist, is for folks who are inexperienced, they may ingest more because of the delay. So the last question is, what are the effects of mixing marijuana with alcohol, tobacco, or other prescription drugs? And Chris, you spoke a little bit about nicotine already. If you want to pick up there.
The risks associated with them?
The effects.
Yeah, I mean, the terms that we use in prevention work is like comorbidity, so when things are showing up together. We know that usage rates for alcohol, tobacco, other drugs, which include cannabis, that it's common for things to show up together. But there's not a whole lot of information in the data that I've looked at that says if you're using this, this will happen. Or if you use this and this together, this is a terrible combination. Or if you mix this, it will turn into ammonia inside your body and immediately kill you. There's a lot of fear around those things. I think every adult who uses a substance has encountered what is good for their body and what's not good for their body. And through legal use, that there are experiments that adults can make in the safety of their own home. I think where it gets scary is for young folks who may be in situations where they're pressured to use things together that they haven't used before, and they don't know how it's going to affect their body. and how they'll respond or react to it. I know a lot of the work that we do in sexual health education, when we talk about the decisions that young people make and the decisions and the values that you hold while you're sober are not the same decisions and values that a person holds when you're under the influence of either cannabis, alcohol, or other drugs. So it's something, it's definitely a conversation to have.
And Officer Zuko, in your role as school nurse or Dr. Lane, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just from experience with some young kids, I know that by choice, from the ones that I've spoken to, some of the kids, like, they wouldn't say smoke marijuana to relax and be using cocaine at the same time. You know, the kids use things kind of for one purpose. My past working in corrections, I know that a lot of the more, I'm not talking about not high school kids, I'm talking about experienced drug addicts and users. In the drug testing we did, like you said, in a panel, THC, opioids, and traces of cocaine would show up in all the drug testing. So that's a little more hardcore. It depends on the population you're dealing with too.
Okay.
And I would just add, you know, anytime you combine substances, you just risk getting way more intoxicated than you intended to. And I think alcohol and marijuana tend to be used together just as social settings. So, you know, someone might have a sense of, this is my limit on how much to smoke, but then when you've had 4 beers and you do that, you know, on top of that, it's just saying, like, you can suddenly be a lot more impaired and there can be negative consequences from that. One other thing that I didn't say, just also this is separate from combining substances, but, you know, there is one population which is people that are at risk for schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, where marijuana definitely increases the risk of onset of psychotic episodes. It can prolong the length of a psychotic or manic episode. So there are definitely some specific risks there.
Okay, thank you. So that is all of your questions. Thank you everybody for coming out tonight. The Community Health Coalition is open to anybody, so an open invitation to join those meetings. They are the first Friday of the month at 8:30, and they alternate between our 2 high schools. And if you want to find out more, you can email Chris Tucci. We have another forum coming up next month. This one will be a follow-up to an earlier forum we did for parents. So it'll be targeted at parents, but anybody is welcome. And we'll be sharing some of we'll have a group of young people sharing some of the results of the most recent Prevention Needs Assessment Survey. Interestingly, a little teaser, we are excited to say that over the last 4 years, we've seen both alcohol use and marijuana use among teens start to drop, and that hasn't happened in our community in like the almost 14 years we've been doing the survey. The forum will be on April 25th. It's called Good Science, Good Parenting. So we'll share some of the data about what is relevant in our community. We will have a panel of 2 doctors sharing just basic scientific, accurate information about how different substances affect our bodies physically in an acute sense, our brains, and then also long-term consequences of prolonged use. The goal is to equip parents with accurate information to share with young folks, and then there'll be an opportunity to use some of the tips and skills from the parent education video to actually practice, like Chris was saying, practice trying out talking about some science with young people. One of the things we're really clear on in the coalition is we just want to support young people wherever they are. So the longer and the more youth delay use, we know we're protecting brain development, and that's our goal. So if a young person is already using substances, abstinence may not be within their reach. Our goal might be to help them figure out how they can maybe wait till the end of the school day. If somebody isn't using substances yet, how long into their brain development are they willing to postpone? So that's the focus of our work, and we were happy to be able to broaden it a little bit tonight with the EDGE to help ignite and continue community dialogue, because it is our job at this point to do this really well for everybody. So thank you all again. Leave us your comments, and we hope you'll join in.